Today's daf, Be'ezus Hashem, is Masechta Zevachim Daf. Masechta Zevachim Daf 96, Tzadik Vav. And we will begin from Daf Tzadik Heilman Beis from the Gemara about 10 lines, 12 lines from the bottom. Ahu Tanura. The Gemara begins and discusses the kashering of an oven. Ahu Tanura. There was this oven, the Atachi Beit Tichye, that they smeared it with, let's call it some type of animal fats. And therefore, so now any bread that you're going to bake in that oven is going to become fleishiks. Asra Rabba Barahila lemechle rifta la'olam. Any Rabba Barahila prohibited any bread baked in that oven to be used. Why? Because even if you plan to use the bread with salt, because dilma asla mechle b'chutcha, maybe you're going to use eat the bread that's baked in that oven with some type of cream cheese, let's say. So therefore this oven was usher, and not only that, you can never kasher that oven. So any bread that's baked out of that oven was something usher to be eaten. So that's the halacha of milchig bread, a fleishig bread that we usher it because you might come to eat it with milchigs. So basically the point of this teaching was that you cannot be mekasher, you cannot kasher a oven. So basically the Gemara asks the question on this story: Ein lashon esiyisa b'chalav, you're not allowed to knead a milchig, a dough with milk. Bimlash, and if you do need it, eat it. Kol akula asura. All the bread is asur. Why? Because you shouldn't come to eat the bread with milk, with meat. I mean, if they made a milchig bread, and because of the hergal avera, they didn't ask you. They asked you to eat the bread with meat. A similar idea, and here's the question: you can't smear an oven with the fats of a tail of an animal. If you did smear it, the entire bread that comes out of this oven is asur, right? So satana. Here's the key. Here's the question. It says that it's an asur oven until you fire up the oven again and kasher the oven. You put it on self-cleaning. So we see that you could kasher an oven. This is a question against Rabba Bar Ahilai. And says the Gemara Tiyufta, it's a question, and he's refuted that an oven could be kasher. Amalei Ravina Ravashi, so Ravina said to Ravashi, Rabba Bar Ahilai. Since we refuted Rabba Bar Ahilai, that you could kasher an oven, Amay Amarav, why did Rav say Kederis, a plate that was used for chametz on Pesach, on chametz before Pesach, and you want to kasher it for Pesach use, you have to break it. You can't use it on Pesach. Now the question is, why can't you kasher these plates? So the answer is Amalei Ra Amalei. So Ravashi answered to Ravina, Rav Moikelahi b'shalmatches. Rav interpreted that story. That brisa that says you could kasher an oven is talking about a metal oven. A metal oven you could kasher, and the kederas that Rav said you cannot kasher was made out of earthenware. Okay, so that's why he didn't allow it. The Ibai is saying, if you want, betanor shel cheres. You can even say that oven that they allowed you to kasher was made out of earthenware. But the reason why you could kasher an oven and you can't kasher an earthenware plate, because zeh has taken b'fnim. An earthenware oven gets heated up on the inside, so you could kasher an oven like you have the matzah ovens that you just heat it up again and somehow take out the whatever was absorbed in the walls of the oven and kasher the oven. The zeh has taken b'chutz, and a plate was heated up, fired up from the outside. From a pot underneath, on top of it's, the fire is not in it, the fire is underneath it, and therefore you can't kasher it well. Says the Gemara, so then why don't we make fire it up from the inside. If you want to kasher the kedera, just put coals on the inside of the pot and kasher the pot that way. And says the Gemara, it's an earthenware pot, so you're not going to put coals on the inside of the pot because chayes alei the mitbere. You're always concerned that it may crack open. So therefore we can't kasher the kedera. Hilkach, therefore, high kuvya, this tile that was used to shape the pieces of bread. So hesekim b'chutz, it gets heated up on the outside, so you cannot kasher it. Va'aser, and therefore it'll always remain aser. Sometimes they would smear it with oil, and they would smear it with oil and break bread with it. That's called tichya, Rashi says. But anyway, it's a tile that was used to bake bread. And therefore, since it's heated up from the outside, you cannot kasher it. Says the Gemara. Ella, so the Gemara asks a question. Ella kedera shel migdosh, the pots of the Beis Hamikdash. Ama yishavru. Why do you have to break it? Why does the Torah say that we can't kasher it? It was made out of earthenware. Just if you could kasher, if technically you could kasher a pot, how? Nahadrinu likhiv shainis. Send it back to the furnaces that created recycle it. Basically, send it back to the furnaces that created this pot, and therefore that will be automatically kasha the pot from all the blias, all the absorption that it had. So the Gemara says, Omar Rav Zera, the answer is because of Hishain Oisin Kivshainis B'Yerushalayim. They could not make furnaces. The manufacturing of these pots were done outside Yerushalayim because of pollution. The zoning did not allow to create a kivshain, a furnace in Yerushalayim. So what's better? What they used to do is take any pot that was made out of earthenware and they just smashed it on the ground. I guess if you excavate, you'll find a lot of broken pieces of pottery on the place of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara asks the question: did they make garbages in the Beis Hamikdash? I mean, if you're smashing it, you're obviously going to sweep it up and put it into the garbage, and you don't have garbage pails in the Beis Hamikdash. Answers the Gemara, but Abaya forgot. Shmaya taught this, and he lived in this place called Kal Navai. And that what? Somehow the Beis Hamikdash had a system where when you break a piece of pottery, it gets swallowed into the ground, and therefore you don't need garbage pails in the Beis Hamikdash because the broken pieces of pottery get swallowed up in its place. Says the Gemara, Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Bavur, they made the ovens in the Beis Hamikdash, made it out of silver. Wait a second, why did it made it out of metal? Ne'evid the cheretz, we now established that if you heat an oven that's made out of earthenware, you could kasher it by just heating it up again. Ne'evid the cheretz, the hesekim epnimhu, make it out of earthenware, and if you want to kasher it, you just reheat the oven, and that's put it on self-cleaning, and therefore it'll heat. So why did they have to go through the expense of making all the ovens of metal? Answers the Gemara, keeping the ika shtei lechem uponim the afiyasim betana. There was the shtei lechem and lechem uponim that had to be baked in an oven, and the only way to make it a kedusha saguf was to bake it in the oven because it wasn't prepared. It was prepared outside the Beis Hamikdash, and they baked it in the oven in the Beis Hamikdash. It got its holiness in the oven. Havale klisharis. This is not just an oven to cook carbon katases. It's a klisharis. It's a keli that's used in the service to create kedusha. So it's a special type of vessel. The oven, klisharis necheres, a klisharis that's made out of earthenware, lo yabdina, we don't make. In other words, since it's adding kedusha, we have to make it out of more expensive materials such as metal. Now we go to oven base. Even Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, who allows a klisharis to be made out of wood. He never allowed a klicheres, a a klishares to be made out of earthenware, and since this oven is like a klishares because it's going to add kedusha to the lechem upon him, therefore it had to be made out of metal. Says the Gemara's story. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yehuda have a ragel kamei de Rami bar Chama. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yehuda was always learning by Rami bar Chama. Shavka he left learning by Rami bar Chama. Ba'azal Rav Sheshes, and he went to Rav Sheshes. So Rami bar Chama was insulted by this sudden leave of his Talmud. Yom Echad Pagabe. One day Rami bar Chama met Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yehuda Amalei, and he said to him, Al kafta nakten reichas liyada. I held, if you hold on to the hands of an important person like a tax collector, the smell comes to your hand. In other words, it was colloquial saying that he's saying that you want to hang around big people. That's why you left me, and I'm too small for you. That's why you went to Rav Sheshes. But don't think you could learn something from somebody so big. Because you went to Rav Sheshes, you're going to become like Rav Sheshes. In other words, get a Rebbe that's I'm more appropriate to be your Rebbe because I'm more or less on your level. Rav Sheshes was at a very high level, and therefore you're not going to learn as much. So why did you leave me to go to Rav Sheshes? That was Rav Yitzchak's question to Rabbi Bachama's question to Rabbi Yitzchak. So Malay, so Rabbi Yitzchak answers, La Mishumah, I didn't leave you because of that. Mar, you Rabbi Bachama, Kibi. So when I ask you a question, possibly Misvari, you give me your own logic to answer a question. When you give me your own logic, but and then when I find a brisa, your whole logic gets refuted. You're not backing your chidushim with what is actually written in brises. Rav Sheshes, he knew all the brises by heart. When I ask him a question, he answers me with a brisa. Even if I would find another brisa and ask the question, it's one brisa versus another brisa, and therefore, one brisa versus another brisa. So then I could ask this question. So it's not refuted. So Amalei. So Rami bar Choma asked Rabbi Yitzchak, "Boy minei milsa, ask me a question. The ifich law kimasnisa, and I'll answer you." No brisa. You don't even need a brisa. My logic is so clear that if you ask me a question, I'm going to answer you like as if a brisa spoke it. So Rav Yitzchak asked him a question. If you cooked in part of a keli, ton marika shtifa or ein toim, do you have to do marika shtifa? Now, marika shtifa was a special type of kashering only used for kli sharis that we find in the Beis Hamikdash. A special type of kashrut. Now we know when blood falls on a beged, when blood falls on a piece of clothing, all you have to do is wash the area where the blood fell on. So the question was, you don't have to do the whole clothing into the laundry, but it has to be washed, the area where the blood fell, and it also has to be washed in the Beis Hamikdash. What happens if you did a cooking in part of the keli? Do you have to do the miriko shtifa on the entire vessel, or just do it on that part where you cook the carbon chatas? Amalei, einatoin, you don't need to kasher or do marika shtif on the whole keli. Just like sprinkling sprinkling blood on a clothing. You don't have to wash the whole clothing. You just have to do that area. Says the Gemara, we never find we didn't find a brisa that says what you just said. And you said, oh, I'm going to answer you. Amalei, so Rami bar Chama said, it makes perfect sense. Mistabra, this is perfect sense. I don't need a brisa. Kibeget, it's like a piece of clothing. Just like a piece of clothing, only needs to be washed, only the place where the blood was. So Marika Shtifa will only be done in the place where it lodged, where it was, where you cooked the carbon chatas, but not the rest of the keli. Amalei, so Rabbi Yitzchak didn't like me. Dame, your svara is not so good. Dam loy mefafeya. blood doesn't spread. When blood flow falls on a piece of clothing, it just is localized. Bishul, when you cook something, mifafeyet, the absorption spreads through the entire pot. Like like we know, when we want to kasher a pot, doesn't matter how much you cooked in the pot, the entire pot needs to be kasher. Voy Tanya, and another brisa, we have a beferish brisa that says not like you. The hazah is more churmadik than rika and shtifa. The hazah, the kashering, the laundering that you do on a baguette because it spilled blood on it, is more stricter than rika and shtifa. And the kashering of a keli, and there's more stringencies by kashering of a klishares from the sprinkling of the blood. There's more stringencies by a blood. Shahazah, the possibility of laundering begadim, it appears by yeshna b'chatois achitzonis b'chatois hapnimius. It doesn't matter what carbon chatas, whether it's a carbon chatas hapnimi where you're not going to eat anything. The blood of that carbon chatas that falls on a beged needs to be washed. Yeshna lifnei is rika, and it applies to blood before you sprinkle it. Masha'en came rika shtifa. The concept of risha b'shtifa only applies after the zrika. After when you're ready to eat the carbon chatas, then you have an issue with the marika shtifa. Marika shtifa nehagas bein b'kachi kachi, bein b'kachi kalam. Marika shtifa doesn't matter what you cooked into the pot, whether it's kachi kachim, which is chatas and ashim, or kachi kalam, a bechor. And the brisa says, "Bishal b'mitzah sakli." If you cook in part of the keli, ta'on marika shtifa kalakli. The whole entire keli needs to be cleansed. Vashen gebazah, hazah is localized. You only have to clean the place of the blood. So here, Rami Bar Chama, Rav Yitzchak found the brisa that disagreed with Rami Bar Chama's logic. And that's why Rami Bar Chama didn't like his Rebbe so much. Rav Yitzchak didn't like his Rebbe. Amalei, Tanya, so Rami Bar Chama agreed. If you have a brisa, it's yours. So, the time of my, what's the reason why? Amakra, no matter what, if you're cooking carbon chatas in a copper keli, the Torah tells you, do marika ushtifa. So even if you're doing a partial cooking in that pot, you have to do this marika and shtifa in the entire pot. I want you to know, it's not just a plain kashering of a keli. We're going to learn that there are differences between kashering a keli and the gzeres akasav that says by a clean choishes that you cook carbon chatas in there, what kind of marika and shtifa is a little bit is another step or two different than a regular kashering. We're going to see that in a moment, and then we'll stop at the Mishnah. Echa kachi kachi. Tanu Rabbanan. Chatas any other chatas kol kachi menayim. Talmud loy mekodesh kedoshim hi. Yochel shani me'arba as a truma. Talmud loy me'oisa prat le truma de Rebbe Yehuda. So this concept of cooking in a copper pot only applies by karbonas, like kachin kachim or kachin kalim, but not if you cook truma. Truma, you don't need this kind of extra kashering. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rab Shimon says this extra kashering of marika shtifa was only by kachi kachim, like chatas and osham. Kachi kachim tina marika shtifa. Kachi kalim, like a bechor, a meiser, ain't a tina marika shtifa. The ksiv, the pasuk says that by the concept of chatas and marika shtifa, kodesh kedashim. The reason why it needs kaddish marika shtifa is because it's holy, kachi kachim and kachi kalim loy. But if it was kachi kalim, it would not need marika and shtifa. So my time with Rabbi Yehuda, then why does Rabbi Yehuda says that even kachi kalim needs marika and shtifa if it was cooked in that vessel? Since I need the pasuk of oisa to exclude truma, there's an extra oisa, a limitation that truma doesn't need marika and shtifa. So if the Torah is mamaya truma, then therefore we can observe, we can infer that kachi kalim does need truma, because kachi kalim is one step higher than truma. If truma doesn't need marika shtifa, then kachi kalim does need marika shtifa. Rav Shimon says oisa k'damrina. I need oisa for something else, to teach you that chatas that had, even a chatas that had a moment of kashrus and it came pasul, that blood doesn't need to be rubbed off. It's only kosher blood that fell on the clothing that needs kibus. Says the Gemara wants to understand right now what's the difference between kashering and Rika and Shtifa. Says the Gemara, Truma loy boy Shtifa Rika, does Truma doesn't need to be kasher? But Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Kedera Shabisha Bal Basal Levasha Bal Chala. If you cooked in a pot meat, don't cook milk in there. Then bishul, if you did cook meat in the pot, benois and tam, then it would aser if it gives off taste into the milk. If you cook milk into the pot, that fleishiga pot, it will aser the milk. If it gives taste, you can taste you can sort of taste the meat in the milk. Truma, if you cook truma in a pot, lo yivasha b'chulin, don't cook chulin in the pot because the absorption of truma will go into the chulin. Then bishul, if you did cook it, nice and tam, it would aser the chulin if you can taste the truma in the chulin that you cooked in this truma pot. So in order for you to use that pot for chulin, you have to kasher the pot. So we see there's a concept of kashering by truma. So what are you telling me that there's no concept of kashering by truma? Amar Abaya says, like Tzricha Eladon Ma Bishop Mixes Ki Ton Rika Shtifa Kolatli. Or the Truma like Tzorach Lamaka Bishop. Abaya says plain that if you kasher, if it was kochi kalem or kochi kochim, if you cooked in part of the keli, you need this Rika Shtifa, you need this extra kashering in the entire keli. But Truma only needs kashering of Rika and Shtifa only in the place where you actually cooked it. Rava says, in other words, to kasher, Rava says there's a plain difference between kochim and truma, and probably everything else. Anytime you want to kasher something, you don't have to use hot water, you can use hot wine. But Rava said, by kochim, Rika and Shtifa is only with water. You can't use hot wine to kasher a keli of kochim. Rabba Barula Amar, Rabba Barula says, there's a difference. Rika and Shtifa b'tzoinim. That means when you kasher a keli, you use hot water. Let's say you're kashering a fleishiga pot, use hot water. But if you're kashering kochim, you need to not only use hot water, you have to use cold water. But a regular case, if you're kashering something regularly, you'd only need to use hot water. You don't need to use both hot water and cold water. Says the Gemara, according to if you're going to tell me Marika and Shtifa is cold water, so then I could have a difference between kochim and regular kashering. But if you're going to tell me that the Torah says Marika means chamim, use hot water, Ushtifa means tzoinin, use cold water, so then that's very similar to regular kashering. So I'm sorry, what is that going to make that? What's that going to make the difference? What's going to be the difference between regular kashering and kashering for kochim? Answers the Gemara, Shtifa Yisera, like we said before, Truma does not need, as Rashi says, Truma does not need washing with cold. All you do is hagol as cham and just scald it with hot water. But for kochim, you need to scald it with hot water and then give it a rinse with ice cold water. Okay, we will stop over here, and so says and Zevachim Daf Vav.